They erased my name at my son's school. They didn't know who I was. Section 1. The Open House, where my name was skipped. The auditorium smelled of expensive floor wax and Joe Malone candles. It was a scent that defined the elite circles of Connecticut. I sat in the third row, adjusted my tie, and waited. Beside me, Evelyn looked perfect. She always did. Her posture was a statement of belonging. Mine was a statement of observation. I wasn't a stranger to this world, but I was becoming a ghost within it. The annual open house at St. Jude's Academy was more than a meeting. It was a census of power. Dr. Samuel Brooks stood at the mahogany podium. He began the roll call of the Foundations Committee. These were the parents who had supposedly built the new wing. I had written a check for $40,000 6 months ago. I knew the list. I knew my place on it. "Heather Whitman," Brooks announced, his voice booming with rehearsed warmth. Heather stood up. She beamed. The room erupted in applause. "James Whitman," he continued. James gave a modest nod. Then came the Doyles, then the Kents. I felt Evelyn's hand tighten on her purse. I felt the air in my lungs grow heavy. Brooks reached the end of the list. He closed the folder. "And to all our other families, thank you for being the heartbeat of this school." He didn't say my name. He didn't say the name Morrison. I looked at the program in my lap. My name was there in the draft I had seen weeks ago. In the final print, it was gone. I didn't cough. I didn't shift in my seat. I stayed perfectly still. I watched Heather Whitman turn around. She caught my eye. She didn't look away. Instead, she offered a thin, pitying smile. It was the kind of smile you give to someone who has just lost a pet. It was intentional. It was a signal. I realized then that the silence wasn't an accident. It was a coordinated subtraction. In this world, if you aren't mentioned, you don't exist. I stayed silent because a man who defends his ego in public has already lost. I let the applause wash over me. I let the exclusion settle into the marrow of my bones. After the ceremony, the lobby was a minefield of social etiquette. I watched James Whitman holding court by the fountain. He saw me approaching. Usually, James would wave me over to talk about the market. Tonight, he suddenly found his watch very interesting. He turned his back to lead a group toward the refreshments. "Caleb," a voice whispered. It was Karen Doyle, the school counselor. She looked at me with a mixture of professional concern and genuine awkwardness. I'm sure it was just a printing error. Dr. Brooks has had a very busy month. She didn't believe it. I didn't believe it. But I nodded. I gave her the most neutral expression I possessed. "Errors happen, Karen," I said. My voice was calm. It was steady. It lacked the tremor of a wounded man. The school's focus should remain on the children. The names on a plaque are secondary. I saw her blink. She expected me to be angry. She expected me to demand a meeting. By not reacting, I made her the one who felt uncomfortable. Evelyn walked over, her face a mask of social grace. "We should go, Caleb. Lucas has a long day tomorrow." She didn't mention the omission. Not yet. We walked to the parking lot. The gravel crunched under my Italian loafers. It was the only sound in the cool evening air. I drove the SUV out of the gates. I looked at the rearview mirror. The school was a glowing fortress on the hill. I understood the game now. Someone had whispered. Someone had suggested that Caleb Morrison was no longer a priority for the academy. In these circles, a rumor of weakness is treated like a contagious disease. I stayed silent during the entire drive. I wasn't sulking. I was calculating. I was remembering every face that had turned away. I was cataloging every hand that hadn't been shaken. The trap had been set for me. They expected me to fight. They expected me to claw for my status. They didn't realize that I was already moving the pieces. When we got home, Evelyn finally spoke. Heather didn't mention us for the gala planning committee either. She was looking at her phone. Her thumb hovered over a group chat. "I'm being moved to observer status in the WhatsApp group." She looked at me, her eyes searching for a spark of outrage. "Let them observe," I said. I hung my jacket in the closet. I straightened the hangers. "The loudest people in the room are usually the most fragile, Evelyn. We aren't going to make a scene. We are going to make a shift." I went into my study. I turned on the desk lamp. I didn't look at social media. I didn't look at school emails. I looked at my private ledger. I looked at the acquisition files for the Whitman Group's primary lender. I realized that the people who were trying to erase my name from a school program had forgotten one thing. I don't just donate to the school. I hold the debt of the people who run it. I closed the laptop. The room was dark, except for the glow of the garden lights outside. I felt a strange, cold peace. The humiliation was the fuel. The silence was the engine. I lay in bed that night, listening to the wind against the windows. I thought about Lucas. He was 10. He was observant. He was learning how the world worked by watching me. I couldn't teach him to be a victim. I had to teach him how to be an architect. I stayed awake for a long time. I replayed the moment Brooks closed that folder. It was a clean break, a total severance. I realized that the social hierarchy of St. Jude's was built on a foundation of perceived value. My value had been deliberately devalued by a small circle of elites. They thought they were pushing me out. They didn't realize they were just giving me a better view of their weaknesses. That was the moment I understood that my biggest advantage wasn't my money. It was their assumption that I was desperate for their approval. I wasn't. I closed my eyes. Tomorrow would be a day of polite smiles and cold shoulders. I would welcome it. Every snub was a data point. Every ignored greeting was a confirmation. I was no longer a participant in their social theater. I was the one who was about to change the script. But as I drifted off, one thought remained. Heather Whitman wouldn't have acted alone. She needed a reason. She needed a catalyst. Someone had told her something that made me look like a liability. I needed to find the source of the leak. I realized the next morning that the school gate was no longer a place of welcome. It was a checkpoint. And I was on the wrong side of the line. Section 2. Polite smiles from people who had decided something. The morning drop-off at St. Jude's was a choreographed ritual. Range Rovers and Porsches lined up in a precise sequence. Usually, I was part of the flow. I would exchange a nod with the security guard, a wave with the other fathers. Today, the air felt different. It was thinner, colder. I pulled the car to the curb. Lucas hopped out, his backpack heavy with textbooks. "Have a good day, son," I said. He didn't look back as quickly as he usually did. He lingered for a second, looking at the group of boys standing near the entrance. They were the sons of the board members. They were huddled together, whispering. "Dad?" Lucas asked, his hand on the door. "Are we still going to the Whitmans' weekend retreat?" I looked at his face. He was searching for something. Reassurance. A lie. I didn't give him either. "Plans change, Lucas," I said calmly. "Focus on your math test. Everything else is noise." He nodded and closed the door. I watched him walk toward the group. They didn't move to let him in. They stayed in their circle. He had to walk around them. My grip on the steering wheel didn't tighten. I didn't feel anger. I felt a clinical, focused clarity. As I pulled away, I saw Heather Whitman standing by the stone pillars. She was talking to Sarah Jenkins and Marcus Thorne. As my car passed, the conversation stopped. All three of them looked at my vehicle, not at me, at the car. It was as if they were inspecting a relic from a previous era. I drove to my office, but the isolation followed me. My assistant, Marcus, looked at me with a strange hesitation when I walked in. "Mr. Morrison, the invitations for the spring benefit arrived. We weren't on the delivery list for the physical cards. I called the school office and they said there was a clerical adjustment regarding the donor tiers." "A clerical adjustment," I repeated. I sat behind my desk. I didn't ask him to fix it. I didn't tell him to call Dr. Brooks. "Thank you, Marcus. Put the digital version in my pending folder. Don't mention it again." I stayed silent because I knew that every person who felt sorry for me was a person I couldn't trust. I needed to see who would stand in the wind with me and who would run for cover. The clerical adjustment was the second strike. It was a formal demotion. I was being moved from the inner circle to the periphery. I spent the afternoon reviewing the portfolio of James Whitman's commercial real estate firm. They were over-leveraged on a development in New Haven. They needed a bridge loan by the end of the quarter. They were counting on a specific private equity group to provide it. I knew that group. I had founded it 10 years ago under a holding company they couldn't track to my name. I realized that James was likely the architect of the school snub. He needed to lower my standing so that when his firm took over my local market share, there would be no social resistance. It was a classic preemptive strike. Ruin the man's reputation at the country club and the school, and you weaken his hand in the boardroom. I stayed in my office until the sun began to set. I didn't take any personal calls. I didn't check the St. Jude's parent portal. I watched the city lights flicker on. I was waiting for the third strike. It arrived at 6:30 p.m. in the form of a text message from James Whitman. "Caleb, sorry we missed you at the open house. Heather mentioned the gala list might have been a bit tight this year. I'm sure you understand. Best, James." It was a masterpiece of passive aggression. It was an insult wrapped in an apology. He was testing my reaction. He wanted me to call him. He wanted me to sound desperate or offended. He wanted a reason to tell people I was becoming difficult or unstable. I didn't reply. I left the message on read. Silence is the only weapon that cannot be turned against you. If you don't speak, they have to fill the vacuum with their own anxieties. They have to wonder why you aren't reacting. They have to guess what you know. That evening, I attended a small charity dinner for the local library. It wasn't a St. Jude's event, but the same crowd was there. I walked in alone. Evelyn had stayed home with a headache, the kind of headache that comes from social rejection. I saw the polite smiles immediately. It was a specific type of expression. The lips move, but the eyes remained fixed and cold. People greeted me with, "How are things, Caleb?" But they didn't wait for the answer. They moved on to the next person as if I were a ghost they were trying to be polite to. I stood by the bar, sipping a club soda. I watched the room. I saw Dr. Brooks whispering with Heather Whitman in the corner. When they saw me, Heather laughed. Not a loud laugh, a soft, pointed one. She brushed a stray hair from her shoulder and looked at me with an air of absolute victory. I realized that they had already decided my fate. In their minds, I was already gone. I was a man who had lost his grip on the ladder. They were just waiting for the fall to become official. I stayed silent because I wanted them to feel comfortable in their arrogance. I wanted them to believe their plan was working perfectly. The pressure was rising. I could feel it in the way the waiters served me. I could feel it in the way the air seemed to move around me, avoiding me. I was becoming a social pariah in a suit that cost more than their cars. It was a fascinating experiment in human cruelty. Toward the end of the night, Marcus Thorne approached me. Marcus was usually a sycophant, always looking for a tip on a stock. Tonight, he was bold. "Tough break about the board seat, Caleb. I heard they're looking for fresher energies this term. James mentioned it at the club. He was gloating. He wanted to see me flinch." I looked him in the eye. I didn't blink. "Energy is easy to find, Marcus. Direction is much harder to maintain. Enjoy the evening." I walked away before he could respond. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a conversation. I drove home in the dark. The silence in the car was heavy, but it wasn't oppressive. It was the silence of a predator waiting for the right moment. The school, the parents, the inner circle, they were all operating on a set of rules that I had outgrown years ago. They thought they were playing chess. I was playing a game they didn't even know existed. When I entered the house, the lights were low. I saw Lucas's door ajar. I walked over and looked in. He was sitting at his desk, staring at a piece of paper. It was an invitation to a birthday party, a party for James Whitman's son. "You're not going, are you?" I asked softly. Lucas looked up. His eyes were red. He didn't say a word. He just handed me the invitation. Across the front, someone had written in bold black marker, "Maybe next year." It wasn't an invitation. It was a taunt. They weren't just coming for my reputation anymore. They were coming for my son. I stood there, holding that piece of paper in the dim light of his bedroom. The restraint I had maintained all week didn't break, but it transformed. It became something colder, something permanent. "Go to sleep, Lucas," I said, my voice a low, steady hum. "The world looks different in the morning, I promise." I walked back to my study. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat in the chair and looked out at the dark trees. I realized that I had been too patient. I had been waiting for them to make a mistake, but they had already made the only one that mattered. They had made it personal. I picked up my phone. I didn't call James. I didn't call the school. I called my lead counsel. "It's time," I said. "Execute the buyback on the New Haven debt. All of it. By Monday morning, I want to be the only person James Whitman has to answer to." I hung up. The silence returned, but this time it was mine. I realized that the people at St. Jude's thought they were the ones deciding who stayed and who went. They were about to find out that the gates to their kingdom were owned by the man they had tried to lock out. But as I sat there, I wondered what Lucas had overheard today. What else had they said to him? Section 3. I realized my son heard more than I did. The kitchen was bathed in the pale, clinical light of a Tuesday morning. I watched Lucas move through his routine, his movements heavy, lacking the usual 10-year-old spark. He was staring into his cereal bowl as if the answers to his social exile were hidden in the milk. I sat across from him, sipping my coffee, maintaining the same composed exterior I wore to every board meeting. I didn't push him to talk. I knew that forced confessions only breed resentment. I waited for the silence to become heavy enough that he had to break it. When he finally looked up, his eyes weren't filled with the innocence of a child, but with the weary realization of a boy who had suddenly understood the concept of a social hierarchy. He told me then, in a voice that was far too quiet, about the locker room talk. He told me how the other boys, led by young Tyler Whitman, had spent the afternoon discussing my impending bankruptcy. They had laughed about how my family would soon be moving to a smaller house and how I was no longer on the list of important dads. I stayed silent because I needed to hear every word. I realized that the adults weren't just whispering behind closed doors. They were using their children as proxies for their own cruelty. It was a cowardly tactic, but effective. Lucas had heard James Whitman tell his son that I was a paper tiger who had lost his touch. My son was being forced to carry the weight of my perceived failure before I had even been given the chance to respond. I felt a cold, sharp clarity wash over me. This wasn't just about a skipped name at an open house or a missed invitation to a gala. This was an attempt to dismantle my legacy from the roots up. I put my hand on Lucas's shoulder, not in a way that suggested pity, but in a way that signaled a pact. I told him that people only talk about those they are afraid of, and that the loudest dogs are the ones who are most worried about the fence. He didn't fully understand yet, but I saw a flicker of trust return to his eyes. After dropping him off, I sat in the car for 5 minutes, watching the parents gather in their usual cliques near the school entrance. I saw Heather Whitman holding court, her laughter ringing out across the parking lot like a challenge. She saw me, and for the first time, I didn't give her a neutral nod. I looked right through her, as if she were a piece of the architecture that had become outdated. That was the moment I understood that my restraint was being misinterpreted as weakness. They thought I was hiding because I was ashamed. They didn't realize I was observing because I was preparing. I drove to the city, making a mental map of every connection Heather and James had. Their power was built on a fragile network of favors and social debt. They were the masters of the polite smile, but they had no idea how to handle a man who didn't need their smiles to survive. I spent the rest of the day in a series of quiet, high-stakes meetings. I didn't mention the school. I didn't mention the Whitmans. I spoke only of interest rates, debt-to-equity ratios, and the aggressive acquisition of commercial paper. By the time the sun began to set, I had a clearer picture of the Whitman Group's vulnerabilities than James did himself. They were bleeding cash in their New Haven project, and their primary lender was looking for an exit strategy. I offered them one. It was a clean, silent transaction that would place me at the head of their creditors committee. I realized that the information traveling among the parents at St. Jude's was nothing compared to the information moving through the financial corridors of the state. While they were busy deciding who was in for the next cocktail party, I was busy deciding who would still have a house to host one in. The pressure was building, but I wasn't the one who was going to crack. I was the one who was going to determine the point of failure. Section 4. Information travels faster. Among parents. By Wednesday, the atmosphere at St. Jude's had shifted from cold to toxic. The information had evolved. It was no longer just about my financial status. Now, there were whispers about my marriage, about Evelyn's disconnection, and about my supposed erratic behavior. I walked through the school hallways during a parent-teacher conference and felt the eyes of every mother on my back. It was a coordinated social hit. I saw Sarah Jenkins whisper something into her phone as I passed, her eyes darting to me with a predatory glint. The speed at which a lie can travel in a private school environment is faster than any market crash. It's an ecosystem designed to identify and eject the perceived weak. I stayed silent, walking with a measured pace, my expression unreadable. I knew that any defense I offered would be picked apart and used as further evidence of my desperation. I entered the conference room to meet with Dr. Samuel Brooks and Karen Doyle. The air in the room was thick with a practiced, artificial empathy. Brooks started by talking about community values and the delicate balance of the school's donor ecosystem. He was speaking in circles, trying to find a polite way to tell me that my presence was becoming a distraction. He mentioned that some parents had expressed concerns about the stability of the Morrison family's involvement in the upcoming capital campaign. I realized that Heather Whitman had done her job well. She had turned my silence into a void that she filled with her own narrative. I looked at Brooks, letting the silence stretch between us until it became uncomfortable. I didn't interrupt him. I didn't defend my record. I simply asked him if the school's curriculum still prioritized logic and evidence over hearsay. The look on his face was one of pure, unadulterated shock. He wasn't used to being challenged with such quiet, surgical precision. He stammered something about perceptions being reality in a community like ours. I nodded slowly, as if I were taking notes on a particularly dull lecture. I told him that I agreed. Perceptions were indeed reality, and that it would be a shame if the school's perception of me was based on the financial insecurities of a few over-leveraged board members. I saw Karen Doyle's eyes widen. She knew exactly who I was talking about. I stood up, buttoned my blazer, and thanked them for their time. I didn't ask for my name to be put back on the donor list. I didn't ask for an apology. I left them in that room, staring at each other, wondering if they had just made a very expensive mistake. When I got to my car, my phone was buzzing with messages from the St. Jude's Dads group. James Whitman had posted a photo of a new boat he had supposedly bought, a blatant display of wealth intended to signal his dominance. The comments were filled with sycophantic praise from the very men who had been my friends 6 months ago. I realized that they weren't just following James, they were terrified of being the next Caleb Morrison. They were clinging to him because he represented the safety of the pack. I deleted the app from my phone. I didn't need to see the digital version of their cowardice. I drove home, thinking about the look on Brooks's face. The shift had begun. It was subtle, invisible to the naked eye, but the foundation was already starting to crumble. That night, Evelyn and I sat in the living room, the house silent around us. She told me that she had been uninvited from the library committee's lunch. She spoke with a quiet dignity, but I could see the hurt in the way she held her glass. I realized then that my patience was a luxury she didn't always share. She was on the front lines of the social war while I was fighting in the shadows of the financial one. I told her to wait. I told her that the most powerful thing she could do right now was to show up to the next school event, look perfect, and say absolutely nothing about the rumors. Silence changes what people assume, I told her. If you don't fight the lie eventually has to fight itself. I stayed up late, reviewing the final documents for the Whitman acquisition. The information was all there. James hadn't just been talking about me, he had been using my supposed downfall to distract his investors from his own bleeding balance sheet. He was a man drowning, trying to use my head as a stepping stone. I felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The trap was fully set. He thought he was winning because he had the loudest voice in the parking lot. He didn't realize that I had the only voice that mattered in the bank's executive suite. I closed the folder and looked at the clock. Monday was coming, and on Monday the information traveling through St. Jude's would change once again. But this time it wouldn't be a rumor. It would be a confession. Section 5. Silence changes. What people assume. The following Monday morning, the atmosphere at the St. Jude's drop-off line was thick with an eerie, expectant stillness. I pulled my car into the circle, but this time I didn't look for a friendly face or an opening in a conversation. I simply sat behind the wheel, staring straight ahead, wearing a mask of total indifference. I realized that my previous attempts at being pleasant had been seen as a plea for re-entry. By opting for total, chilled silence, I was changing the gravity of the situation. I watched James Whitman climb out of his car, adjusting his sunglasses with a theatrical flourish. He looked over at me, expecting me to look away or perhaps offer a submissive nod. I didn't. I looked at him with the vacant intensity one might use to study a stain on a wall. He fumbled his keys. It was a small, almost imperceptible slip, but it was the first crack in his polished armor. Inside the school, the whispers had reached a fever pitch, but they were starting to lose their rhythm. When you don't provide a reaction, the gossipers begin to eat themselves. I heard Sarah Jenkins and Heather Whitman in the hallway near the gymnasium. They were talking about a foreclosure notice that had supposedly been seen at my house. I stopped, turned slowly, and looked at them. I didn't say a word. I didn't point out that my home was owned outright through a family trust. I simply stood there for 5 seconds, let the silence hang like a heavy curtain, and then continued walking. I stayed silent because their imaginations were far more destructive to their own credibility than my truth could ever be. By not denying the rumor, I made it look like the rumor was too pathetic to even acknowledge. I saw Heather's face flush. She was losing control of the narrative because I refused to be a character in it. By midday, the information began to pivot in a way that none of them expected. A local business journal had published a small, dry blurb about a major debt restructuring in the Connecticut real estate sector. No names were mentioned, but the details were specific enough for those in the know. James Whitman's name began to be whispered in the same breath as liquidity crisis. Suddenly, the polite smiles I had been receiving started to look like masks of panic. The parents who had ignored me for 2 weeks were now trying to catch my eye, searching for a sign of what I knew. I realized that my silence was no longer being interpreted as a sign of defeat. It was being interpreted as a sign of secret power. If I wasn't worried about the rumors, it must be because I had something much bigger in play. The psychological pressure in the room shifted from me to the people who had tried to bury me. I went to pick up Lucas from his soccer practice that afternoon. Usually, the other fathers stood in a tight cluster, excluding me from their talk of golf and private equity. Today, the cluster was broken. James Whitman wasn't there. Marcus Thorne approached me, his voice lacking its usual edge. "Hey, Caleb, we're thinking of grabbing drinks at the club later. You should swing by." I looked at him, and for the first time in weeks, I smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a man who had already seen the end of the movie. "I'm busy tonight, Marcus. I have a closing to attend to." I didn't tell him what I was closing. I didn't tell him that I was currently the majority holder of the notes on his own firm's office building. I let him wonder. I let the silence do the work. As I drove Lucas home, he noticed the change. He asked me why everyone was looking at the floor when I walked by. I told him that people only look at the floor when they're afraid they've been walking on thin ice. Section 6. The day the administration changed its tone. The call from Dr. Samuel Brooks came at 8:15 on Thursday morning, his voice, once booming with the confidence of a man who decided which families were worthy, was now filtered through a layer of desperate politeness. He asked if I had a moment to come to his office to discuss a clerical oversight regarding the upcoming Science Wing naming rights. I didn't say yes immediately. I let the phone line stay quiet for 5 seconds, just long enough for him to hear his own breathing. I realized that the power balance had finally inverted. The school's endowment was heavily tied to the very institutional funds I had just moved under my corporate umbrella. Dr. Brooks wasn't calling to apologize for being a bully. He was calling because his board was suddenly realizing that the man they had snubbed was now the man who held their financial leash. When I walked into the administration building, the receptionist, who had ignored me for 10 days, stood up immediately. "Mr. Morrison, the director is expecting you. Can I get you some water? Espresso?" I declined with a simple shake of my head. I walked into Brooks's office and sat down before he could offer me a seat. He was sweating. He spent the first 5 minutes explaining how the open house incident was a tragic mistake by an intern who had since been reassigned. I stayed silent because a man in his position will keep talking until he accidentally tells the truth. Eventually, he did. He admitted that James Whitman had pressured the committee to prioritize his name over mine. He admitted that the school had felt obligated to follow the lead of the board's most vocal member. He was looking at me, begging for a sign of forgiveness, or at least a promise that the funding wouldn't be pulled. I looked at the framed photos on his wall pictures of him shaking hands with governors and donors. He was a man who lived for the appearance of authority. I realized that the best way to handle him wasn't to shout or demand a public apology. It was to show him how little his authority actually mattered. I told him that I wasn't interested in the naming rights anymore. I told him that I found the environment at St. Jude's to be lacking in the moral clarity I expected for my son's education. The color drained from his face. If the Morrisons left and the funding followed, it would be a hole he could never fill. I stayed silent after that statement, watching him scramble to offer solutions. He suggested a special dinner. He suggested putting my name on the main library instead. He was offering me the world, but it was a world I had already decided to dismantle. As I left the office, I ran into Heather Whitman in the lobby. She looked frantic. Her phone was pressed to her ear, and she was pacing back and forth. When she saw me, she stopped. She didn't offer a thin smile this time. She looked at me with a mixture of horror and realization. She had clearly just heard from James. She knew that the paper tiger had just bitten back and that the bite was fatal to their social standing. I walked past her without a glance. I didn't need to gloat. The consequences of her actions were unfolding naturally, without me having to lift a finger in public. The school administration was now falling over itself to distance itself from the Whitmans. By the time I reached my car, the school's internal portal had already sent out a correction regarding the donor list. My name was at the top. James Whitman's name was gone. I realized that true authority doesn't need to be announced. It is felt the moment the support beams are removed. The psychological pressure was now entirely on the administration and the inner circle. They had built a house of cards on the assumption that I was a passive participant in their games. They didn't realize that I was the one who owned the table the house was built on. I drove away from the school feeling a quiet, cold satisfaction. The invitations would start coming back soon. The polite smiles would return, but they would be tinged with fear. I had regained my reputation, but I had done it by showing them that I didn't need it. I stayed silent during the drive, thinking about the final move. It wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. Section 7. Invitations return without explanations. The shift in the social atmosphere was not a slow thaw. It was a sudden, violent crack in the ice. By Friday afternoon, my inbox was no longer a desert of clerical errors. It was a flood of urgent updates and social reconsiderations. I sat in my study and watched the physical invitations arrive, stiff, cream-colored envelopes delivered by couriers. There was no mention of the previous 2 weeks of exclusion. There were no apologies for the deleted emails or the full guest lists. The invitations simply returned as if they had never been withheld. I realized that this was the most cowardly form of surrender. They wanted to pretend the humiliation had never happened so they wouldn't have to address the fact that they had failed to destroy me. I stayed silent because responding to these invitations would be an acknowledgement of their power to grant or deny them. I left them in a stack on the corner of my desk, unopened, a silent monument to their collective panic. That evening, the doorbell rang 3 times. It was Sarah Jenkins, then Marcus Thorne, and finally a delivery of expensive wine from the Kents. None of them spoke to me directly. They left cards with vague, flattering messages about long-standing friendships and unfortunate misunderstandings. I realized that the information had finally reached the final stage of its evolution. James Whitman's firm had officially declared a liquidity crisis, and the news had hit the country club circuit like a bomb. The man who had been the king of the parking lot was now a social leper, and everyone who had followed him was looking for a new center of gravity. They were turning to me not out of sudden affection, but out of a desperate need to be on the right side of the next power shift. I stayed silent because I knew that their loyalty was as shallow as their original betrayal. I didn't need friends who only appeared when the weather cleared. I took Lucas to the weekend soccer tournament on Saturday morning. The change was physical. As soon as I stepped out of the car, 3 fathers who had looked through me only days ago began walking toward me, hands outstretched. They didn't mention the market or the school board. They talked about the weather, about Lucas's incredible footwork, about anything that could fill the void where their integrity used to be. I shook their hands with a cold, professional distance. I didn't participate in their forced camaraderie. I realized that the quiet power shift was now visible to everyone. James Whitman was nowhere to be found. Heather was sitting in her car, her windows rolled up, staring at the field with a hollow expression. She had gone from being the queen of the committee to a ghost in a designer tracksuit. I didn't feel joy in her misery. I felt a clinical sense of completion. The social order of St. Jude's was restoring itself, but the hierarchy had been permanently altered. The pressure had moved from my shoulders to the very foundations of the school's social structure. People were now overcompensating, trying to guess what my next move would be. Would I pull Lucas from the school? Would I call in the notes on their businesses? Would I demand Dr. Brooks's resignation? I stayed silent because the uncertainty was my greatest leverage. As long as I didn't speak, they were forced to live in the reality they had created for me. A reality of fear, isolation, and constant second-guessing. I watched the game, cheered for my son, and ignored the desperate glances of the people around me. I realized that this was what true dominance looked like. It wasn't a shout or a public execution. It was the ability to remain unchanged while everyone around you was forced to reinvent themselves to stay in your shadow. Section 8. What authority looks like when it isn't announced. The final gala for the St. Jude's Capital Campaign was held at the historic Ashford Estate. It was the same event I had been deleted from only 14 days prior. Tonight, I arrived late. I didn't wear a tuxedo that shouted for attention. I wore a charcoal suit that whispered of permanence. When Evelyn and I entered the ballroom, the music didn't stop, but the conversation did. It was a ripple effect, a wave of silence that followed us from the door to the center of the room. I realized that I didn't need my name on a plaque or a podium to be the most influential person in the building. Authority, when it is real, is atmospheric. It doesn't require an announcement. It is simply understood. Dr. Brooks approached us within seconds, his hands trembling slightly as he offered a toast to our most visionary patrons. I looked him in the eye, gave a single, slow nod, and moved past him without saying a word. I saw James and Heather Whitman in the far corner of the room, near the service entrance. They looked small. They were still dressed in their finest, but the light had gone out of them. They were no longer the architects of this world. They were the artifacts of a failed coup. James tried to catch my eye, perhaps looking for a moment of grace or a chance to explain. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a confrontation. I didn't need to hear his excuses. I had already signed the final papers that morning that would finalize the acquisition of his firm's debt. He was no longer a rival. He was a tenant. I stayed silent because a moral victory doesn't need a soundtrack. The closure was found in the fact that I was still standing exactly where I had always been, while they were drifting into the periphery of a world they no longer controlled. We stayed for exactly 1 hour. We spoke to the people who had remained neutral, ignored the sycophants, and maintained a level of dignified restraint that made the previous 2 weeks feel like a fevered dream. As we prepared to leave, I saw Lucas standing near the entrance, waiting for us. He looked at the room, then at me, and I saw that he finally understood the lesson. He saw that his father hadn't fought back with insults or anger, but with competence and timing. He saw that the world's opinion is a fickle thing, but character is a bedrock. I realized that this was the most important donation I had ever made to the school, a living example of how to handle a world that tries to erase you. We walked out of the Ashford Estate, the cool night air hitting us with a sense of total liberation. The drive home was quiet, but it was a shared, peaceful silence. Evelyn took my hand, and for the first time in weeks, she looked completely at ease. I realized that our reputation hadn't just been restored, it had been hardened. We were no longer just a successful family. In the St. Jude's directory, we were the family that couldn't be broken. I stayed silent as I looked at the glowing dashboard, thinking about the future. I wouldn't seek revenge against Brooks or the Doyles. I wouldn't gloat over the Whitmans' fall. I would simply continue to operate with the same quiet, ruthless efficiency that had brought me here. The school would continue, the galas would happen, and names would be read from lists, but everyone in that town now knew what happened when they tried to skip the name Morrison. I sat in my study one last time before going to bed. I looked at the stack of unopened invitations and swept them into the trash can. I didn't need them anymore. I didn't need their approval or their clerical corrections. I had regained my status by proving that I was the one who defined it. I realized that the loudest people in the room are indeed the most fragile, and that silence is the ultimate luxury of the powerful. I turned off the lamp, leaving the room in darkness. The humiliation was gone. The betrayal was settled. The dominance was total. I closed my eyes, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction. The story of the shadow parent had ended, and a new era of undisputed authority had begun. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe.